without being talked to yet. Hey, I wonder if you guys can hear me now. And probably the dog. All right. Yeah, it turns out that the screen I was on was not including my my mic. So, yeah, that's always good. Always a good start to this whole thing. I'm not sure why it's showing two input captures. So, yeah, we're going to start going through this thing, and there we go. Hopefully now it should be a little bit better. So let's get started all over again, and I will just say everything I've said twice now. Okay. Let me know in the chat if you actually are hearing me at some point here. If not, then I might have to start and figure out what's going on. Otherwise, give me a second. Okay, good. My version over there is hearing audio now. So, great. Let's start this all over again for the third time. Great start to this stream here. Okay, I'm Pete. At this point in time, I've said it multiple times, and you've probably seen me mouth it multiple times, but here's an actual version of this audio. I'm Pete. I go by Caustic Worm typically in the role-playing game forums, and I've been running and playing games for at least 40 years. Oh my god, it's been a long time, since the 80s. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today though is the game world that I'm currently using, and we're going to basically be going over that game world and making a gazetteer for players. So sort of high level descriptions of the various places on the world map, something that the players, if they are playing in the world, and the characters would know the information they would know, and in general kind of filling that out so that if anybody wanted to kind of join in the world, or I had a new player start, I could hand this to them and say, hey, here you go. First, I'm doing it now, even though I've been running games for about 2.5 years in this world by now. But better late than never. At this point, the reason why I'm doing it now is that the world map is finally complete, and we'll be looking at that here in a second. And so it's nice to, now that I've got the world map in a state where I'm ready for it, it's nice to go through all of the sort of the names and stuff on there and start writing out the various player-facing descriptions. We will not be covering anything that would be considered secret or anything like that today in this stream or anything like that. It'll be purely what players and their characters would know. So, if anybody's on here who might be playing a game and is hoping, or that they might hear spoilers or something like that, not going to happen today. Might happen in future streams, but not this particular one. So let's kind of get into it. A couple things about this world before I show the map. As I think I mentioned earlier, either muted or unmuted, I came up with this world from a concept in the late 90s. And it started off as something that I was working on as I was moving around for job purposes. Never really did much with it other than kind of coming up with history and a variety of older gazetteers. There is some notepad somewhere that's got an old version of a gazetteer for things. But never really used it until the early 2000s, where I did break it out and start playing a campaign in it. At that time, the world was, well, when we get into the concept, you'll understand a little bit more. The world was a little less accessible from a playing standpoint. So the game ran for maybe 6 months, and then kind of after 6 months, ended up moving again. So that kind of killed the game at that point. For the last maybe 10 to 12 years or so, maybe a little longer than that, I haven't really done anything with it. Kind of forgot that I had made it. It was more the pandemic that kind of brought this thing back out. Pandemic and kind of cleaning out some old hard drives and going, what the heck is this? Oh yeah, I totally remember this now. And then modernizing it a little bit. So taking some of the concepts that I had before and changing it up to more something more modern, something that fit more with role-playing games. Now, there are some themes in this in the game world that are more mature and are not as can have some trigger warning stuff on them. So as we get to some of those things, we'll talk about that and the reasons why I've chosen to do that. And then, but for the most part, I've been running this games in this world for the last 2 years. As a pandemic and I kind of refreshed it, I started a game with my kids in the world, and then as a previous Pathfinder game kind of ended, I started running that game in this one. And recently, like a year ago, I started a third game that's kind of that's kind of sort of monthly, depends on how things are going and things like that. So that's kind of the background of everything. So let's kind of get to it a little bit. So I'm going to start here first with, it's going to be, well, I'm not sure that I'm setting this up. I've set this up correctly for the way I want to start this, but we're going to head over to this where I've got the map in a small portion of it, the whole overall map, and then sort of the Gazetteer as we're going to write it as more of the larger thing. Beginning to wonder if maybe I shouldn't have flipped those, which might not be terribly hard to do, but maybe for next time. So the map here, as I kind of zoom in and up on the top, is the complete map of the world. Now, of the known world. Let me be clear that this is the known world. I call it Niar'tyr. Why? Just because I thought the name was interesting, not because of anything else. Originally, as I kind of created some of these things, originally as the world was made, it was all flying islands. So kind of, if you look at this whole thing, you can see that there is an aspect of this that is darker than the rest of it. So probably it's not translating very well in the stream here, but the darker area is water. And the lighter area around it all is pure air. This thing is actually a floating island floating in the air. And originally, when I first created this stuff, the water didn't exist. There was some water in a few places. For instance, some of these lakes and stuff existed from the get-go, but most of the water that you see here was just not there. The whole point of the game was, if you wanted to go anywhere between islands, you had to get a skyship of some sort. And in the early 2000s, that seemed like a cool idea. But the more I thought about it, as I kind of revamped the world here a few years back, the more I realized that, some of the more traditional games weren't going to work very well with this concept, in the sense that, most players when you start off are not going to have access to a skyship, so they'd be stuck on whichever sky island they were going to be on, and that would be the end of it. And pirate games would be a little more difficult, swashbuckling and sort of that sort of stuff. If you fall off the airship, you fall to you fall forever, as far as anybody knows. So, or you fall to the to the land and kill yourself. Sure, there'd be some concepts of things like probably have more rings of feather fall and probably have the equivalent of parachutes and hang gliders and stuff like that, and they still do in this world. Well, clearly, because they still have airships, but it just didn't seem to feel quite right. So I decided to turn this stuff into having more water, put the bulk of the islands in the water, have some of the islands still be sort of floating in the air, and the main island itself is floating in the air. This also gives me the ability to have, for instance, an underworld, sort of the denizens of all the caverns and stuff all underneath, and have massive cabins underneath there, and potentially even other things as well, which is sort of secret at this point. But in general, it still allows me to have the same normal, typical feel for like a Pathfinder or a Faerun, but also still have some other high fantasy elements with the sky ships and things of that nature. Plus, there's some of the stuff is not really represented very well here on this map, but there are sky islands floating above some of this water area and things like that, so it allows people to explore in sort of 3 dimensions and that sort of stuff. So, what do I want to do for today? Well, I want to make a Gazetteer. For people who are watching and want to participate, either can ask questions, provide possible ideas. I will be giving a sort of a disclaimer. I do not want anything like Bodie McBoatface or anything like that, so I reserve the right to say, hey, that just doesn't fit. For the most part, though, I do want to be more collaborative than I have in the past with some of my world making and things like that. So I do want to hear what people have to say, and hey, if something doesn't make sense or doesn't feel like it fits right or something like that, by all means, we should kind of, I'm more than willing to have a discussion of that, and somebody tell me, hey, this sounds cool, we should do something, you should do something like that. So we'll see what happens as people start to sort of go through this. So let's start here with a couple things. The first one being, I want to sort of describe just the world itself so that we are kind of all on the same page. And then we'll start going through a few other things. Like, I want to discuss sort of the people of Niar'tyr, so sort of the species in this case. We'll touch a little bit on the different kingdoms and that sort of stuff. But we'll touch on more of that as we go down through the main islands. I don't know how far we're going to get today. We'll see. And yeah, hopefully we'll get through some of the high level stuff, and then I'll probably do another stream until this thing is completely filled out at this level of map. I'm currently working on a map for the western portion of Niar'tyr, which would be sort of the 3 seas regions: the Sea of Tears, the Sea of Heroes, and the Sea of the Lost, sort of all the way up through the Gulf of Margali. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. So as that gets more completed, and then there'll be more of a drive down into the Gazetteer of that. So normally people say, hey, do bottom up, so get your small little village that you're going to send the players into and do all that sort of stuff, and run them through that and slowly build out as you need. And in the past, that's kind of what I've done. However, at this point in time, I'm now far enough with the rest of the world that I'm going to sort of go from the outside in, and attack this sort of thing as we're going from the high level down to the lower level. In general, most people of the game world do know most of what we're going to talk about. Like, the low-level peasant or something like that may think some of these things are fantastical or don't believe them, but they've at least heard of them in some fashion. So let's start with Niar'tyr itself. So Niar'tyr is just the name of this known world. So I don't know really how I want to put this down in the Gazetteer at this point, so it's just more the main floating island that the peoples of the land live upon. It has a bit of a history. Archaeologists on the island, as of now, know that history goes back at least 5,000 years. Just because of archaeological digs and sort of that sort of stuff, and figuring some things out like that. The oldest known humans on here are the Echinosians, which we'll talk about, or the oldest known, let me rephrase that. The oldest known continuous record is the Echinosians. Their history goes back at least 2,000 years. But there are ruins of kingdoms from well before that. There's the Malazan Empire, which we'll talk about at some point, which abruptly ended about 5,000 years ago. That's why they know there was at least history that far back. And there is remnants of a human kingdom even further before, at least the same time, if not earlier than that. That kind of fell also at about the same time and was overrun by goblin kind and that sort of stuff. That particular set of history is taking more center stage in my second game. The first game is taking more center stage around the Malazan. So some of this history actually is in use as time goes on for the games themselves. So we may dive into that as well as we get through. The known ages right now are about 8,000 years ago, and before that is called the Age of Mystery, which the reason why it's called that is most of the archaeologists have found very little from that time. So it's just been them trying to piece together anything from before that time. After that is sort of the age of the Malazan. The Malazan is an empire of Saurials, so Naga people, serpent people, alligator people called Alex, and that sort of stuff. definitely they know of at least about 1,000 years of history during the age of the Malazan, and it ended abruptly at what they're calling the Cataclysm about 5,000 years ago. After that was sort of what is called the Dark Ages, or the Age of Monsters, something of that nature. That lasted till about 2,500 years ago. Maybe a little longer than that, maybe a little less than that, maybe 3,000 years ago. I can't remember exactly what I have down, but we're close on this. And that was basically when, after the fall of the Malazan Empire and the human kingdom that they think happened at the same time, was around there at the same time, Goblinkin, so things like goblins and orcs and those sorts of things sort of rampaged across most of Niar'tyr and enslaved any humans that were still remaining, and created their own kingdoms of that nature. As part of that, and as we kind of moved to the next age, which was the Age of Dwarves, which came about till about 2,000 years ago, or thereabouts, maybe about 1,500 years ago. As the dwarves it's called the Age of Dwarves mostly because the dwarves in their mountain homes basically became sort of the drivers and shakers of the world. They sort of expanded out of their mountain homes, drove back some of the Goblinkin, and carved out some surface kingdoms during this time. The reason kind of why the Age of Dwarves sort of ended is the largest of their dwarf homes, called Niar'tyr, mysteriously collapsed in the sense that the dwarves fled from it for some reason. The dwarves that are now outside and in the cities, as we get into more of the peoples of Niar'tyr, are basically the remnants of the dwarves of Niar'tyr. They are now considered, they don't have a home. They were not taken in by the other dwarves, and they basically seek to reclaim their old home, but it's been lost to time, so not very many people remember none of the dwarves remember where it is. A few have tried to find it, but no one seems to have. That was the concept of the first campaign that I ran with the kids, and they actually did find Niar'tyr, but then we had to stop it. So there's more to be found there. Niar'tyr is intended to be sort of a mega dungeon, so multiple levels. And lots of interesting things to find as to why the dwarves were driven from that home and what happened there. But different campaign, different time. As sort of towards the end of the Age of the Dwarves, the hobgoblins created a massive empire. So they created an empire, if we kind of look at the main map, that sort of was all of this central portion. So, Sirvine, Kelvine, maybe up into this lake in this area. Not really any of Solvine or Telvine. So they mostly had the pretty massive empire in here. Now, there's another aspect to this that's hard to show on this map because it's not made for that. But all of this here was also land. Because about 1,500 years ago, water started rising, and over the course of about 500 years, the water rose up about 100 feet or so, 100 to 150 feet, which inundated this lowland here on the sort of where the Gulf of Margali is. So that sort of made the Zendaki Empire, the Hobgoblin Empire was called the Zendaki Empire, same as this Zendaki expanse here, kind of retreat. Because they had to move their cities up, and as part of that, the various humans that they were administering to, so not subjugated, but in many ways one set was subjugated, and we'll talk about that in a bit. They rebelled and basically threw off the yokes of the empire and started creating the human kingdoms again. And so that kind of brings us back to the next age, which is sort of the Age of Men, and that is up until the present day in the game world. So as the Zendaki Empire kind of fell back and slowly declined, as the people kind of the humans and halflings and dwarves that they were ruling kind of threw off their yokes, various other kingdoms have come up from that, many of which we'll hopefully talk about today. So that's kind of the Cliff's notes of at least history as we know it as of right now. There are other aspects of that I do have some more information on, but those are considered secrets. So for now, we're not gonna talk about those. So let's talk about the peoples of Niar'tyr. There is a variety of species. So we've got our typical humans. We've also got dwarves, as we just talked about a little bit. We've also got halflings, as well as half elves. We haven't really talked about the Fae yet, which we'll get to at some point as part of this. Probably not today, though. We do have gnomes as well, and some tieflings, which we'll come back to how they came about in a little bit. And those are the main races or species. Sorry, trying to keep the normal, trying to use the more modern description of these sorts of things. These species are the main ones. So there are orcs still, and half orcs. Yeah, actually there are, yeah, I should be doing that. There are orcs, and there are also hobgoblins. I forgot about that, because the hobgoblin empire, just because it fell doesn't mean that there aren't still hobgoblins, and they are a normalized part of society. Although in many cases they're part of mostly the criminal underbelly. But so you'll notice there are a few things that aren't here. There's no dragonborn, nothing like Goliath. You notice that there is no elves here, even though there is a half elf. They do exist, but they're very xenophobic. There's a few of the other sort of specialized species, things like the various elemental folks and that sort of stuff are technically not here. Warforged are not here. A few things of that nature, and there are reasons for that. Not because I hate those races, those species, or anything like that. It's more just they don't fit quite right yet in this particular game world as it stands, and or I want to introduce them in a different way over the course of campaigns and things of that nature. So let's kind of go through some of these guys. We're going to start with humans first, because they sort of dominate the lands right now, and as part of that we will sort of discuss a little bit of where they're at, and kind of who they are. Now, humans in this case, there are a few subspecies of humans. Now I'm calling them subspecies, but for the most part, in the sense of a role-playing game standpoint, they're just the typical human from D&D or that sort of stuff. Although I do have some specialized versions of them for people who want to be more in the flair. So there's the dowry, and it is pretty much pronounced like dowry. So just so people understand that. There are the Sirli, there are the Margali, and then there are the Echinosians. So these are the main human subspecies, so to speak. Actually, there is one more, and then there's the Valinir, which we'll talk about a little bit more here. So I keep on forgetting there's one more too, which I'm going to put up here first because it makes sense. All right, so the Airdae. The Airdae are they consider themselves the oldest men. Many of them claim that they can what's the word I'm looking for? They can follow their line back to a kingdom, to a human kingdom at the same time as the Malazan. But the problem is that much of their records have been lost to, rampages by the orcs and the goblins and things like that at some point during the ages. But they claim to be the first men or something like that. So they claim to be the first men, but the problem is that they tend to only have a very small subset of this place. So most of the Airdae come from this place in here, where you've got Regenwald, Ergoth, and Vendor, and Norgund. These are called the Airdae Shires. That's pretty much where they are. That seems to be, they claim this is sort of the remnants of their kingdom from several thousand years ago. They're probably the best way that I would put for them right now, and the way I kind of do this when I sort of write some of these things down, is these are basically considered German. They're kind of have a German analog of some sort where, they're very German or Anglo-Saxon kind of thing, where they're that kind of thing, where they're sort of Northern European style kind of peoples. I haven't done a lot with them yet, so they're kind of one of these spots that I'm open to suggestions on for how to approach them. I'm still looking for something that is somewhat unique to them. I don't quite have it yet, and nobody's really ever come from these places anyway from the game so far, so hasn't really been filled out very much. But they for now they tend to mostly keep to themselves. I wouldn't say that they're xenophobic or anything like that. They're sort of if you don't go looking for trouble, it won't go looking for you kind of thing, kind of feel. So it won't find you kind of thing. So that's why they never really try to push out of any of their lands or anything like that. They're not very warlike. They seem to just be very content in their lives and where they live and what they're doing. But that doesn't mean that they're all like that. Surely there would be adventurers and things that come from this, or people who feel like they are missing something and want to explore the world and that sort of stuff. But for the most part, there would be that kind of thing. The Dowry are sort of what I would call a Gaelic style set of people, but with a twist here. So they are mostly in this northern regions of Kelvin. There are some here over in Solvine, but we'll talk about that in a minute as we talk about half-elves. They are also called the horse lords. They grew up on these plains here in the north and tamed the horse, and for the longest time had some of the best cavalries in the nations that are currently on Niar'tyr. And they're also sometimes called the Griffin Lords because they have tamed griffins and have sort of one of the few air forces in the realms as well. That's changing because we've got skyships and things of that sort of going on, but for the longest time they've had air superiority, which has helped them to keep their kingdoms pretty much safe from other places. As we talk more about the Searly and that sort of stuff, when we get to that, it'll be a little more interesting. But they are, like I said, they're sort of a Gaelic influence, Irish kind of influence, with they're basically horse lords and tend to sort of a cross between Gaelic with some of the Mongols, in the sense that they've perfected the ability to fire bows and things from horseback, and all the cavalry that goes with that, and fleet of foot and that sort of stuff. They tend to be very maneuverable and that sort of thing. The other part about them is that they are matriarchal. This is one of these, I cannot spell matriarchal. This is one of those things where I wanted a little bit of a twist here. So for the Dowry, everything kind of goes through the women. Women tend to be head of households. They tend to be the ones that are sort of the knights and that sort of stuff. Men still are knights and things like that, but women tend to have the higher prestige. The inheritance goes through the female line. Typically, for instance, the leaders of these countries are queens. The kings are just king. They're just the men that they've married, and they're not really called kings. They're basically called prince consorts or things of that nature. It's the women are the one that become the new queens as the old one passes on. So this is sort of it's still very feudal in the sense that there is fiefdoms and feudal serfs and things like that in this world, and especially in this particular set of kingdoms. It's not quite that bad. Serfdom is more of a Searly thing than it is a Dowry thing, and in some ways in the last 200 years or so, this society has been slightly changing to be more, that's what I'm looking for, be more meritocracy than just matriarchal. So there are some men that are starting to be more administrators and things like that, due to the fact that they're good at it, and have learned and are starting to do that sort of stuff. But this has led to some interesting things, like youngest sons, things like that, are usually sent to the clergy or sent to be sergeant at arms, or tend to the farms and things like that, or tend to the horses and that sort of stuff. They tend to, sort of the things that might have gone towards sort of lesser folk, or the peasants in the past, in serfdom and feudal things. So they're that sort of stuff. So yeah, instead of a lot of nunneries, there are a lot of monk monk brotherhoods around Dowry, because that's where some of the younger men have been sent off to get them out of the household and that sort of stuff. Doesn't mean that there aren't the equivalent of female priesthoods and things like that, but so just some odds and ends and things like that sort of come from this. So I would say brotherhoods of monks and things like that. In sort of the Gaelic influence of this sort of stuff, their pantheon tends to be very naturalistic, and we'll kind of go over that as part of these sorts of things over time. So they tend to venerate things like nature and Mother Earth and the wind and fire and that sort of stuff. So a lot of their stuff tends to be more naturalistic, as opposed to concepts like the Margali. When we talk about the Margali, their pantheon is more concepts like nobility and honor and things like that. So that's kind of the things for the dowry. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go any further into that until we actually get to some of the kingdoms and stuff. So let's talk about the Seerli. The Seerli are sort of a French analog, and there's a reason for that. Because the Seerli came from here on Cervine, so we're kind of the Seerli are different though than the Dowry, although they are considered sort of a lost clan of the Dowry, in that the Seerli were enslaved by the Zendaki. So the Zendaki Empire, when they first kind of came out of started to amass land and try to take over portions of the world, they enslaved the Seerli people, because they found this clan on Cervine, and they enslaved them to build their cities and things like that. So this particular set of humans started off in slavery, and interestingly enough, that will color sort of some of the things that they do as we move forward with this group. But about 700, 800 years ago, one of them, by the name of Leon, fled across the waters to Hirochi, and I just realized that I forgot one of the peoples called the Ave, and learned the ways of the Ave, or at least their honor system, which is basically a form of Bushido. So he and some of his followers came back to Cervine, and basically started an insurgency. And as sort of the water started rising, and the Seerli rebelled against their masters and drove them away from some of the cities, taking over various spots. Now, given that for the longest time this group of people was broken apart into various clans that fought each other after driving out the hobgoblins, and quite frankly enslaving many of them as they did so. Turnabout's fair play, I guess. And so they basically fought against each other for the longest time, until about 500 years ago, when they were all until when one of the greatest, Leon Montaigne, united all the clans by conquering them and bringing them all under one banner, thereby marking the beginnings of the Seerli kingdom. So yeah, now these guys are a little interesting in the sense that they believe in one god called Seer, the god of light. But they sort of in sort of the sort of an analog of Catholicism, they actually believe in many saints as well. They believe in several saints who are sort of aspects of their code of honor, their code of their code that they live by. So things like duty, honesty, loyalty, courage, these sorts of things are the various saints are dedicated to each of sort of these aspects. And so the code of Seer, as it's called, is a massive. It's a big part of everybody's life, especially the nobility in the Seerly kingdom. So they believe that the more you follow the code of Seer, the more likely it is that you will be taken to Nirvana or utopia upon your death. And the clergy of Seer promote that idea as well. So clearly that is part of it as well. The other part about Seerly is that in the past 300 years, they have been pretty warlike and pretty expansive. So originally they were just on Seerveen here, and we'll talk about some of their cities and stuff at some point. But at a certain point, they crossed the channel here and started attacking basically what were Dowry kingdoms or Morgali kingdoms, or Valarak was a Morgali city-state at one point, and started trying to take these over. So as of the current present day, they have taken over Valarak, they have taken over Isli and Airly. These were all Dowry kingdoms at one point, and they're now marches under the control of the High King Gerard Montané. So the way that the Seerly kind of do their conquering is they basically conquer people, leave most of the certain level leave most of the administrators at a certain level alone, but then install basically Seerly nobility above them. So basically the barons and the marquis and things like that are Seerly, but most of the administrators are still, in this case for these people, Dowry or Margali. Mostly because they just don't have a lot of people. They're a kingdom 500 years old. They probably have, a few thousand people, or not a few thousand, probably, maybe around 1 million people at most amongst all the stuff. And so being warlike and expensive, you gotta work with what you have with people there. So another thing about the Seerly is that they tend to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Purists. So you are considered only if you're part of the nobility, you need to be pure-blooded Seerly. You cannot have any kind of other blood in it. So, for instance, if you were a bastard son, so that some Seerly lord had a child with a Dowry woman, wouldn't matter. They would disown that child, and it would not be considered noble. And many of the non-nobility in the Seerly cities and things like that are basically that. They're combinations of different humans and things of that nature. Don't have a pure blood Seerly ancestry. So a little bit purist in that sort of sense, at least for the nobility standpoint. Those are the big things for that. Purist, and the last thing kind of about them, and it's more the Seer portion of this. The Church of Seer is known to send out inquisitors, and this sort of follows again sort of from the purism or the purist sort of thing. The Church of Seer believes that all arcane magic other than artificing is considered heretical to Seer and must be put an end to. Originally that was a secretive thing, but in the last few years it's become a very open thing as it became less and less secret, and more of an open secret. They finally just did away with that and basically started sending inquisitors abroad to try to wipe out wizards and sorcerers and even things like the Fae if they found them, that sort of stuff. No one knows why this is considered heretical. The Church of Seer, it was just declared as an inquisition by the Church of Seer from the word of Seer. So yeah, who knows why this is the case, but that is currently the case. The rest of the nations have taken offense at this because they're basically sending people into their sovereign territory, and so that's part of the main conflict in the world right now. Is the Seerly kingdom being relatively warlike to begin with, even though it hasn't really attacked anybody for about 30 years. But then also, the Church of Seer trying to push all of their beliefs onto others in that sense. So yeah, one source of conflict in this world. Margali are sort of a Spanish Italian analog, Mediterranean. These guys are some of the best seafarers in the known world. Probably on par with the Echinosians, but we'll get to that in a little bit why. So Margali mostly came from this area and here, and this is mostly where they're at. These are the city-states of the Margali: Salazar, Navigari, Valaris, Margali, Mirabar, Ventimar, and Esperance. There are more smaller cities here, but these are the main city-states of what are called the Margali League. They, like I said, tend to be sort of a Spanish, Italian, Mediterranean analog. So their cities tend to be, think of them as, the city-states of Italy in the, during sort of the beginnings of the Renaissance and that sort of stuff. And so each city-state is run by a duke. They have a council of the dukes that kind of run the league together, so it's a confederacy more than anything else. And even not even that, it's probably more of a mutual protection league as opposed to anything else. So yeah, they tend to, as I was pointing out earlier, their pantheon tends to be more about human ideals. So nobility, luck. So things like nobility and luck and beauty and what else do I have? I should really bring up another. Yeah, things of that nature. And they tend to treat like they're an interesting society in the sense that they believe that the winds of change will always, and luck are always on their side. And so, currently the main city is called Margali, but that's because the family who runs it is called Margali. Same thing for Mirabar and most of the other things, most of the other cities. In the end, the highest of the high could be brought low by bad luck, and the lowest of the low could be brought up to become, nobility, depending on how well their luck is. So they truly believe that everything is all based on how the gods smile upon them, how lucky they are, and that sort of stuff. So this sort of leads to some interesting stuff. This leads towards people who will sometimes just pick up and leave and go because they feel that their luck will change if they go somewhere else. This leads to things like the nobility spending a lot of their money on a variety of things to not necessarily improve their luck, but because they feel that helps keep the populace and that sort of stuff liking them, and so reduces the chance of things like somebody getting designs upon their seats. So there's a lot of many of these cities have a lot of their cities have a lot of things like parks and theaters and that sort of stuff, so that while there is slums in these areas, the slums of like Mirabar and Margali tend to actually be less slummy than something like a Calastria or Lumiere or the cities of the Dowry, just because the nobility tends to be spending money on these things to try to keep the people happier. And it does work to some extent. So yeah, Margali society tends to support the lower classes a little bit better, due to the nobility spending money on things. So like on the arts and things of that nature. So for instance, typically, like, there might be a once a month the nobility will basically pay for all the tickets in a theater and just say the theater's free for the next 2 days or something like that. And so everybody, including the fishermen and the downtrodden, can go and partake in watching an opera or a play or something of that nature. So the people tend to be a little more, even a little more better educated in some ways, because they tend to see some of these things or get some of these things done. The Margali and the Searly are kind of at odds at this point. The Margali did take over one of the Searly city-states, which is now called Valarak. It wasn't called Valarak before, and that's what the Searly called it when they took it over. They have reached some of the swamps around Margali. The Searly have, attempting to try to take over Margali, but those were repulsed, since the swamps are much better by the Margali than they are the Searly. And so there's sort of a detente right now in that sort of world. The Margali tend to be much better naval, tend to have a much better navy, but the Searly tend to be much better at sieges and military warcraft and that sort of stuff. So as of right now, they're sort of in a cold war against each other, especially given the fact that the Margali tends to be some of the better tradesmen, and so typically are the ones that can set up an embargo to prevent the Searly from getting some of the things they want or need. That being said, Margali, the city of Margali here, right here, is the largest city in the known world at somewhere around 500,000 people. It is built across multiple islands. At the sort of the head of this river that comes through the swamp here, and is basically is the largest trade hub in the known world. So a lot of the trade goes through that particular city to the various other places. When we get to that city, there's some interesting things about that as well. Like, for instance, the floating island that they're literally mining, that they have large rock trolls and stuff kind of mining that is sort of chained to the ground, which is where they get a lot of their things like Ethereum and stuff of that nature. They also have the most skyships, which right now has helped to keep the detente against the Searly, because they sort of have an air force and the Searly do not. So that's the Margali. So let's talk about the Ekanosians. Ekanosians are, like I was telling you before, are considered the Niar'tyr claim that they're the oldest, they're the first men, but the Ekanosians have the longest running history. The Ekanosians are basically a Greek analog. So they're also city-states, with 8 city-states right now. And each city-state, each city has a patron god, similar to what the Greeks would have had in the past. But we can't talk about the Ekanosians without talking about Sithrau. About the same time the water started to rise, rifts open up along this island that at the time was not necessarily called Sithrau at the time, but is now, and demons came forth. 4 of the 12 city-states at the time were lost into these rifts. I haven't put them where they were on this map, but I probably could. And so 3 of the gods were considered lost and corrupted by the demons. 1, however, was not lost. It was bound, as it was able to resist and is considered the bound god to this day. So there's some mythology there that fits in with the rest of the Ekanosians here. The Ekanosians, like I said, are very Greek-like in the sense that they do have a sort of a senate that is the wealthy landowners, basically, that are elected by the wealthy landowners for each city. and landowners, merchants, the wealthy basically elect these people. It is egalitarian though, so the senators are men and women. So from that standpoint, they are at least unlike the Greeks. And these are all the city-states: Nicosia, Echinos, Thalasar, Perolgus, Stenai, Amphithrae, Meliscos, and Tragazi. The current strongest city-state is Meliscos. So even though everything here is called Echinos, Meliscos is the current strongest of the cities. I don't know if there's a lot more to say about them. Again, nothing. Well, there is something more to say about them, especially when we get down to the tieflings. Because of their proximity to the Sithra Rift, they have been corrupted somewhat by the demons, and so most of the tieflings come from this area. In some fashion. That doesn't mean that there aren't some that are corrupted via sort of the dowry over here in Vorthir and that sort of stuff, the kingdom here, because some of them do come across and do attack here, but the majority are coming from this area because they tend to get the most attacked. So yeah, the Echinosians for a long time before the Sithra were considered a very strong naval power and plied trade quite a ways, including trading with the Zendaki because they were not part of the Zendaki Empire. So they are the equals to Margali, if not maybe sometimes better, as naval people. But with the rise of the Sithra, they've had to become a little more warlike, a little more defensive, and so tend to have pulled back more and to protect what they have, especially since the demons come out at random intervals. Interestingly enough, no one's seen any of the demons come out for about 100 years. So the Echinosians now are actually starting to sort of cautiously expand out again and try to improve their influence in the world. Have to deal with the demons from Sithra, the Sithra Rifts. Okay. Valinir is the last set of humans that we want to talk about, and the Valinir are basically Norsemen. And you're going to say, what do you mean Norsemen? Well, they come from the northern lands north of the Icy Deep. So they're literally the sort of the equivalent of the Vikings, and which is kind of ironic because they have to sail quite a ways to even get to some place where they could raid. So sometimes I wonder if I made the right call there, but that is what they're currently sort of an analog towards. They tend to raid each other a lot more. There is some what's what I'm looking for. There is some fauna in the mountains here of Valinir, so they are mostly self-sustainable. It's just during the long winter months that they tend to come further south and brave the long journey to raid some of the coasts of like Solvine and Hirochi and have gotten as far south as Sirvine as well. It's I guess I should probably I haven't really mentioned what the scale here is. Here's your scale. This is about 250 miles. So, if you look at that, you're probably looking at about 500 miles to Telvine, maybe a little more than that, but nobody lives on Telvine. So you're looking at, probably 750 miles here. So, that's like a good, 10 days of travel time. So, yeah. So they don't do this unless they absolutely have to. I don't have a lot about them, just because no one's come from there and no one's really asked about them yet, so I haven't really had to dive much into their thing. But I can say they are clan based, and natural and sort of naturalistic clan based. So you've got you have a clan that's based off of wolves and oh my god, so wolf clan, Thunder Clan, things of that nature that all live sort of together. They tend to, the women fight just as well. as the men, and they do. Some of the clans do sort of have closer relations in the sense that, you know, alliances and stuff like that, so that they're, you know, it's not completely, you know, it's not like they're marrying their cousins and stuff like that all the time, but yeah, so they tend to be very Norse in nature and that sort of stuff. Longhouses, that kind of thing. And longboats, although their longboats do have, with a double sail, they have learned the a more modern set of sailing techniques from some of the people who have either they have captured on their raids, or who have actually come to the north, because there are reasons to be up to the north for trade and things of that nature. So that's most of the humans. I'm going to take a short break, I think. Well, let me just have a short drink and then we'll move on. Okay. Let's talk dwarves. Okay, dwarves. Dwarves at one point, so there's two types of dwarves. There's there's city dwarves, and then there's the mountain dwarves. So the city dwarves, as we sort of talked about a little bit during some of the historical bit, the city dwarves are sort of the remnants of Vir Torvak, or in some cases the outcasts from some of the other dwarf homes. For the most part, the city dwarves are a little downtrodden because they have not really been under the earth and that sort of stuff, but they have kept it to their ways of worshiping the forge, and in general still keep some of their traditions, but they've had to sort of, you know, tailor them towards more of a human-centric kind of existence, since they tend to live more in the human cities at this point. They are several of them continue to try to find Vir Torvak, but it has been lost. Its location has been lost to time. And if someone were to find it, they would probably try to make a claim upon it and repopulate it. It's kind of all there really is for the city dwarves. They're basically just short humans at this point. They still have some of the things like poison resistance and high constitutions, and they tend to be things like armorers and smiths and things of that nature. But for the most part, they have lost some of that. That's what I'm looking for. Some of that dwarven fire that they once had. The mountain dwarves, however, all still live in dwarf homes, and they are the most well, for the most part, they are xenophobic. But there is one dwarf home which is not, and that is Vir Kovak. And Vir Kovak is the rulers and the controllers of Emerdal. So if we kind of come back to our map here, that is all the way over here in Izardum. Emerdal is the front-facing spot for Vir Torvak, or Kovak. It is in here somewhere. No one knows exactly where. The dwarves are pretty good about keeping the entrance to it secret. But for the most part, any trade that they do is through Emerdal, so most people don't really push it, because they're just... Dwarves are trading with people anyway, and they're doing it through here, through intermediaries through there. There are definitely some dwarves from Vir Torvak, or Kovak, sorry, too many names very similar, that are in Emerdal. And you can find access to things like the Dwarven Rune Mages there as well. They also tend to have a monotheistic pantheon, where they worship a dwarf called, for lack of a better term, the Forge. And is they believe that this dwarf is this god is the creator of their people. They were created on the Forge, and any dwarf who is skilled at working with the Forge and working metalworking and all of these things, smithing and that sort of stuff, is considered touched by their god, and in many ways is how their clergy works. Most of their clergy are blacksmiths and forge workers and foundry workers and things of that nature. So as far as most people know, that is the only god that they worship. But maybe there's others. Who knows? Yeah, mountain dwarves. That's kind of mostly the mountain dwarves. There are more dwarf homes, but and one is known, which is in the northern mountains up here. There is a dwarf home. The Dowry know about it. They have sent emissaries every so often, and those emissaries come back basically saying, "Hey, they tried to shoot us with guns and crossbows. We fled." So they're even more xenophobic than the rest. There are supposedly 3 or 4 other dwarf homes, but no one has been in contact with any of them for many, many years, and so most of them are considered to be lost or extinct. So most dwarves in the world either are city dwarves coming from the cities, or they are some kind of adventurous dwarf from Virkavak, which is not likely. Most of the dwarves in Virkavak don't want to come out and see the humans or any of those people, because they don't really want to deal with them. So that is sort of the dwarves. Let's talk a little bit about halflings. This one's actually going to go pretty quick, because the halflings are basically the halflings just live with humans. They have pretty much figured out that the humans got the best place for them, and so that's where they live. They pretty much just adapt to the places that they're living in. So the halflings in Margali tend to act like the Margali. The halflings that live in the various areas of the Dowry tend to act more like the Dowry. It's just that they adapt to the culture that they're in. That being said, I tend to think of them as sort of Cajun in analog. So if you hear me talking, throwing out some Frenchish sounding, somewhat Cajun sounding names, it's usually a halfling. Doesn't mean it always has to be that way. It's just a way for me to differentiate them between other places. Halflings tend to have large families still, but in general, it's just they are like the culture they live in. As far as anyone knows, there is no dedicated halfling country or city or anything like that. They either tend to live in amongst the rest of the people, or they might have, for instance, a quarter in a city. So, like, there is a halfling quarter in the Margali, in Margali. As some of the players have found that there is an enclave of halflings in Calastria, but for the most part, they tend to live in amongst everybody else. Yeah, that's mostly halflings, half elves. So let's talk a little bit about the Fae. The Fae no longer live, well, not entirely. So we're gonna talk about the Fae in general first. So they no longer live in general on Niar'tyr. There are a variety of gates that they had created that take them into the Feywild. So gates to the Feywild, and they guard them jealously. And so most Fey, if you encounter in Fey on Niar'tyr, it is a very unusual thing. So just because they tend to, either one of two things has happened. Either there is something that they need on Niar'tyr, so they've sent someone out to gather it, or you have gotten close to one of the gates to the Feywild, and it is guarded. Those are usually the only two ways that you would find a Fey, except for the third way. So the third way is Solvine. So Solvine is the home of the Gwylid or Gwylith monarchy. And why do I say that in here? Well, the Gwylith monarchy is a combination of humans and Fey. Several hundred years ago, when some of the dowry fled across the channel to Solvine to avoid being attacked or being assimilated into a larger kingdom, they landed here, tried to create their own kingdom, and ran into the last remaining Fey on Niar'tyr, the ones that were literally living here. After some brief skirmishes over about a 50 to 60 year period, the queen, who was dowry, brokered an agreement with the Elven king that they would that their two eldest children would marry, uniting the two and creating in essence a human Fey kingdom. So many, if not all, of the half-elves come from this area on the world. Clearly there's exceptions, given the fact that we have one in our game, in one of the games, but most half-elves comes from here. If you wish to play an elf on this world, it would literally have to come from here, and would have to be okayed by a GM. In my case, for my world or for my games, basically we'd have to have a reason why one of the elves decided to leave the Gwylith monarchy to do something. There would have to be a reason for it. But for the most part, this is where the only elves potentially could come from. This is where most half-elves come from, and it is sort of an amalgam of the half-elves that live here are sort of an amalgam of dowry society and Fey society. So more egalitarian even than what the modern portion of the dowry is. This tends to be very equal rights for both. Though most magical knowledge tends to be in the hands of the Fey. The wizard council that is in the Gwylith monarchy is all Fey, and it's hard to get into it if you are not Fey. That being said, they tend to have one of the longest unbroken lines of historical knowledge and are just not sharing it because, well, they're Fey. So yeah, I mean, the Council of Wizards in the Gwylith monarchy is definitely has probably more, well, definitely has more detailed histories than even probably the Echinosians. So just because they have an unbroken line back to Fey that have been living for centuries, if not millennia. But yeah, so the half-elves that come from the Gwylith monarchy are in general more of a in general they tend to be similar to the dowry in what they believe and their culture and that sort of stuff. There is sort of a what's what I'm looking for? There's sort of a melding of the pantheons between these two. So these two cultures. So while it is much of the people share the dowry. That's what I'm looking for. Dowry pantheon. Some of the Fae pantheon is starting to make some inroads, especially in the capital. Inroads into the nobility, especially in the capital. So there's some unique aspects to this particular to half-elves in here, where in most game worlds, half-elves are sort of considered a species without a home, where neither the elves nor the humans really want them. In this world, basically they all come from one place where they are accepted, and it is the natural way. Like these two cultures have merged together as a way to avoid conflict, and have created their own sort of carved their own country out of this place. So it's a different take on half-elves in that sense. Okay, got about 45 minutes before I want to stop, so let's talk gnomes. So we might basically just get through all the races, which I also forgot about one more. Probably get through the races today, and then or the species today, and then we'll go from there on the next one. Gnomes. We do have a gnome player. In fact, we have 2 gnome players in my games. But I haven't really given a lot of thought to gnomes. So I'm going to talk about gnomes in the way that I've been using them in the game, and then we'll kind of go from there. Most gnomes in the game, most NPC gnomes, have been, in essence, artificers. So that's probably one aspect of them. They tend to tinker, and are intrigued by the ability to create magical things, which is sort of the rock gnome, I believe, from the D&D book. They do have a couple of cities, a couple of towns more than cities. So there are enclaves of gnomes. Enclaves of gnomes do exist out there. One of them is Glittercrag. Glittercrag is the sort of the city that's built into the bottom of the island that's floating above Calastria. Has an enclave of gnomes. But gnomes more dedicated towards tinkering and artificing and that sort of stuff, mining, that sort of thing. The 2 gnomes that are in the game, one of them is a seeker of knowledge and a scholar. The other one is a loot goblin. Was brought up by dwarves and is a loot goblin. So I'm not sure that I would call them good examples of gnomes. So gnomes are something of a mystery. That's not entirely true. I forgot. Most of the gnomes they've met are tinkerers. However, they did one of the NPC gnomes though is an archaeologist. So I would say right now that they're kind of information seekers or things of that nature right now. They're so think of them as scholars and that sort of stuff. And like I said, there really isn't on the map per se. There really isn't any, like, there's a couple of places where they have enclaves, but I wouldn't consider them having any sort of nation or kingdom or anything like that currently. They're part of that. Probably something where I'd want to ask people what gnomes should really be like in this world. Like, they're short, but I'm considering them intelligent and seekers of knowledge, I think. I don't even know that I have an analog for them. Like I have the other ones where I say, hey, they're Italian, or, Italian analog, or Cajun or something like that. I think I've just kind of left them as a mystery. Doesn't mean I want to keep it that way. I haven't found the right thing myself, and the people who are sort of playing the gnomes haven't really wanted to delve too much into their back history, so we haven't really sat down and tried to talk through what that might mean. So probably something worth talking about though as time goes on here and we move forward. Tieflings. Let's move on to tieflings, because I don't have a lot for gnomes, and I do have a bit more for tieflings. We kind of briefly talked about tieflings. We mentioned that most tieflings are going to come from, Ekenos and in the Sithral region, maybe Straits of Dread, that sort of stuff, possibly Vorithir. That's just because that's where the influence of demons is most heavily. But yeah, they are sort of the outcasts of, in the general case, of Ekenosian society. And well, outcast is probably not the right word, because maybe the lower caste of Ekenosian society. And the reason why I say that is because we didn't really talk about this too much with Ekenosians, but the Ekenosians have a clear influence in them of demons. So typically they have a wide gamut of skin tones, including a deep ruddy red, from some of the influence of the demons in the area, or even sort of a lighter green, similar to orcs and things of that nature, even though that's not an orc thing here, that sort of stuff. So it's very clear that the demon traits and things like that are slowly infusing Ekenosia anyway, and so the Ekenosian the tieflings are just a byproduct of that. So for the most part, tieflings tend to have the same culture as the Ekenosians, and just because they're a lower caste doesn't mean that they can't advance in society. They do. They definitely do. There are definitely some tieflings who are senators and things like that. There's in various Ekenosian cities. So they're considered lower caste by default, but that doesn't mean they can't move their way out of it. What this also means is that tieflings are not as feared in Ekenosian society as they are, for instance, in other societies, in say the Dowry Society or Margali. Actually, Margali are okay with them too, or Searly Society. So a tiefling who is traveling the Sea of Tears and the Sea of Lost Souls and the Margali nation, city-states and stuff like that, probably not going to have much of a problem. But a tiefling that heads into the Searly kingdom probably going to have some issues with some of the locals there. The Dowry are a little more tolerant, but they will look at them askance, probably give them a symbol to ward off evil, but are not just going to throw them in jail or anything like that. The Searly might, though. Tieflings, for the most part, because it's a latent manifestation of demon blood and things like that, still have all the same things. Yes, I know that in D&D mostly tieflings are devil oriented. In this case, I'm treating tieflings as either demons or devils, and as a general rule, you can kind of sort of pick and choose a little bit on the tiefling abilities stuff, especially the new stuff where they have more variants. You could potentially use some of that stuff instead. So if you wanted to have cold resistance, that just means you're through a different demon line than fire resistance and things of that nature. I'm gonna skip orcs for a second, and I'm gonna put orcs last here. mostly just because, well, there's a reason why. We'll get to it in a little bit. So let's talk about hobgoblins for a little bit. For the most part, the hobgoblins basically are just now part of the human societies. Although the hobgoblins in the Niar'tyr Kingdom are basically indentured servitudes, or indentured slaves, indentured servants. They're considered to be unholy, and so are used by the Niar'tyr, or are basically, they're indentured servants. So as a way to work off their penance for being unholy, they're basically slaves. They're treated relatively well. They're not treated badly in that sense, but they're treated relatively well. But they are still slaves in the Niar'tyr Kingdom. In the rest of the places, in the rest of the kingdom, and the rest of the human societies, it kind of depends. It somewhat depends. Many of them are just like humans and do many of the same jobs. They're just so just like anything else. But the hobgoblins in Margali, in the Margali city, are basically the mafia. They have several crime. They basically formed several crime families, and are the mafia. And it works out that way mostly because I don't have a really close enough view on Margali here that we can do, but Margali is like about 8 or 9 islands, and the city is built on all these islands. As the water rose, the city itself was sort of on the floor of where the river kind of flowed through a valley, and as the water rose, it started filling up the valley. So they basically kept on moving the cities higher and higher up on the basically the hills until the water ended, and basically they're just on top of the various hills. And so there are, probably half a dozen or so hobgoblin families that basically have their own turf on the different islands. And so that's the way it works for them. So yeah, if someone were to play a hobgoblin that came from Margali, they'd probably be part of the mafia. But in general, they still tend to have all the same sort of opportunities that regular humans do. No one's keeping them, other than the Niar'tyr, are trying to keep them from anything on purpose. I mean, it's a typical medieval society. Many people try to keep people down and to raise themselves up, but it's just the way it is. So I don't know if there's a lot more to say about the hobgoblins there, other than at one point they used to rule most of the known world, and in that case, and for the most part, it was sort of a Roman style empire. So many of the roads you see on Kelvin and Sirvine were built by the Hobgoblin Empire. They sort of did aqueducts and all that sort of stuff. So in general, they reached a pretty advanced state of technology and things like that. Some of which was lost during the rising of the water. But the hobgoblins have wizards as well, and things of that. And hobgoblins have wizards and priests and all that sort of too. So, and all that as well. So, I just haven't really dug into what their pantheon would be and that sort of stuff. Oh, I did forget one last thing. Down here in Atal Evi, That is the last the last of the Zendaki emperors. Lives on Atoll Eddie or Eki? Evie. I can never remember my own names. So that is also another bastion of hobgoblins. And mostly just hobgoblins, as they pulled back to their as the empire fell. So they tend to occasionally claim rulership over most of Kelvin, of Sirvine and Kelvin, but no one really listens to them. So that's mostly hobgoblins. Let's talk Ave. Ave are bird people. The Ave are bird people, are bipedal birds. Bird people. And they tend to, they come from Hero Chi. So let's bring over here to Hero Chi. So they come from here, from Hero Chi, where they have an empire called the Empire of the Heavens. So the Ave can fly, and much of Hero Chi is spires and peaks and tons of floating islands in the air. Some above the main island of Hero Chi. Others off the coast. And so the Ave evolved to be able to expand into all of that. They also have a pretty decent Air Force, but it isn't necessarily skyships. It is things like dirigibles, gliders, dirigibles, and just the people themselves. So, the Ave are a feudal Japanese analog. So they follow a version of Bushido. Bushido have an emperor, and in general, a strong sense of honor, and family ties. Most Ave adventurers are doing so mostly either to acquire knowledge or because they were cast out. This is a generalization. Doesn't mean the Ave couldn't have other reasons for it, but that's kind of what they are and why they do what they do. There are several subspecies to have different things. So like a crane subspecies, which is sort of the warrior caste, a raven subspecies, which is sort of can do mimicry and that sort of stuff. And I think there was one more, I can't remember what it was, like an owl subspecies, which is sort of their knowledge and priesthood, that sort of stuff. I do not have any pantheon for these guys yet. I haven't really thought much about them because only one person has ever played them, and that game ended before we really got into much depth for it. So this is one of those things that I need to figure out how to figure out more about, and that sort of stuff. So that's all I have for right now for the Ave. We can talk Malaz. So we briefly talked Malaz as part of the Malazan Empire. This is the remnants. This is the descendants of the Malaz on Empire. So this is the Alak, the Naga, and there's one other group, and well, there's more than one other group, but the Alak and the Naga are the best. And the Naga, they're the best known, but there are a few other subspecies that exist, namely sort of a turtle people. If you really wanted to play a turtle person, that does exist, although it would be very primitive. They are still one of those few people from the Malazan that have not been captured and put into slavery, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then a chameleon people. Again, they tend to be able to hide and stuff. So that, again, not a lot of them have been enslaved. Much of the Alak and Naga have been enslaved, mostly by the people on the Blustery Isles. They use them as workers in their fields, their cities, and in general tend to reap the benefits of this. So this is one of those trigger warning kind of things. I do have actual slavery in the game world. Why did I do it? Like, most people are like, hey, I want to get away from real world kind of stuff when I go into my fantasy, but I kind of wanted to bring this in here so that there is sort of another tension in the world. So we have the Seerly and they're sort of wanting their Inquisition, but I wanted another sort of tension in the world where there are people out here who are enslaved and are trying to escape, and so there are people that help them, and there are people who are continuing to try to make to enslave more of them. So I'm not trying to dive deep into this. I'm not trying to make it what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not trying to make it a political statement or anything like that. I am trying to make my world a little more realistic in the sense that there is going to be some sort of, conflict like this in the world. Not everybody feels that everybody is equal and that sort of stuff. So I want to make sure that there is some feeling of that in the world. I firmly believe that it'd be great to have a campaign that's all about freeing them as well. So I don't currently. The current campaign is about something else, but this just provides yet another sort of backdrop to the world to make it feel a little more lived in and a little more realistic. Don't condone this in any way. Do not get me wrong. Slavery, that is. But at the same time, I feel that it is a way to provide tension in the world. And as long as everybody in the game that is playing that can treat it in the right way, then I believe that it's perfectly fine to have something like this in the game world. This is easily something that could be, if somebody wants to use this world, it's easily something that can be replaced. Instead of them being, Malazan or anything like that, and slaves, it could just be, I would replace them with Warforged, and this is sort of robots that are the taking the place of this, that are not necessarily sentient or anything like that. So I think there's an easy way to kind of replace this if you really wanted to. Yeah, so that's the Malaz, as I was trying to say, are sort of the descendants of the Malazan Empire. So after that cataclysm, some of the peoples did survive, and they fell back into barbarism and primitive and more primitive lifestyle, and have been that way to this day. About 300 years ago or 400 years ago, well, probably even longer than that, some of them were some of the humans started to encounter these people as they spread out into the Sea of Tears and that sort of stuff, and so saw them as easy. Some of them saw them as easy pickings for being able to get some good work out of them, and so that's sort of how this came about. There are still several islands, so many of the islands here. So Blustery Islands and Calastria are where most of the slaves are at, but these islands here are considered the Malaz Islands. There are several natives still on there. There's several still here. As the adventurers found out at the beginning of another adventure, there's some here. So there are still some in a variety of places. There just tend to be more of the sneaky ones, like the chameleons and the turtle people and things like that are able to stay hidden. That being said, if you were to land on the Malaz Isles here, right here, there are native Alec and Naga that would probably attack you, because that's where most of the slave raiding is still happening at this time. It's not as much as it once was, just because, for lack of a better term, there are a lot of slaves here now. In fact, there are more slaves on these islands than there are other people. And so that they have more than enough to sustain themselves for the time being. So while there are occasional forays to try to get more, the return on investment isn't as good, as a really horrible way of saying that they don't necessarily go after more people now. Yeah. Malaz are a playable race. In fact, one of the guys is playing an Alec in one of the games. I don't see any reason not to, although he is having to be a little careful in Calastria, since they are currently there, and freed slaves are not necessarily a good thing there. But in general, yeah, that's the Malaz. All right, let's talk orcs, and then we'll probably wrap it for today. Orcs, at one point, the orcs were the warlike species that you know is similar to that is what is what you find in like. Find in World of Warcraft or the traditional D&D. D&D. That is not the case anymore. As after the Dark Ages. Remember, we had talked about that way up here, the Age of Monsters, or the Dark Ages. During those Dark Ages, they were warlike, but as that age sort of ran down, the dwarves pretty much put a beating on them, put a big beat down on them, almost exterminating them. And so the remaining tribes, clans, whatever you want to call them, sort of went into hiding. It's not exactly, but and became more naturalist and more spiritualist. So they are sort of an American Indian analog at this point. So they tend to roam the forests and the grasslands in small clans, and you know, move around to different hunting grounds, and in general are not super warlike, but they will defend themselves. So half-orcs are not unknown. The orcs do trade with humans, and so half-orcs can easily happen. Even orcs can be found in human kingdoms and cities. They tend to be more, what's what I'm looking for? They tend to be more the type that's more, again, not necessarily an outcast, but someone who has decided that they don't fit in with their tribe and so have went out into the world to learn more about the world. Be interesting to think of them as Amish, so they all go out into their Runspringer every so often. But that's not how I want to look at it. It would just be an interesting thought as an interesting change. So yeah, they're very tradition bound and tend to live a simple spiritualistic lifestyle where they, you know, treat the world as full of spirits that require worship, including worshiping their ancestors and that sort of stuff. So, but anyone could play a half orc or an orc in the game world, and it would be, no one would bat an eye, especially since for the most part they try to keep to themselves, but they do trade with humans. They've been slowly becoming more over the last probably century or so. They've been slowly becoming more, as the human kingdoms have sort of encroached into some of the wildlands that they are in. They've started to reveal themselves a bit more, and, you know, have started to promote trade and those sorts of things, so that they can, which is slowly rising their technology level and things like that. They also tend to be in some of the wild places where there are some of the elder ruins and things of that nature. So, like, they're not necessarily around here, but a lot of the forests here and the mountains in this areas tend to be places where the orcs would be. Some of the grasslands and the mountains up here in the north and in the west or eastern part here also tend to have some orc tribes in them. So these guys tend to trade with the dowry a bit. These guys tend to trade with some of the humans a bit. And so this is places where it would be easy enough for someone to run into an orc in this world. They're not as prevalent as they are typically in D&D and things like that. They're not considered, you know, a major threat like they would be in D&D. Most of that falls to things like goblins and kobolds and gnolls and those sorts of things. So orcs are sort of being a little bit more normalized in this world, and more nature loving, which is sort of similar to what the one new world from D&D, which gave us the Warforged. It's somewhat similar to that, except not quite the same. Those guys are priests of nature and very much sort of the elves of that world. That's not the case here. These are just they tend to just be spiritualistic and worship their ancestors and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's most of the races in sort of a nutshell, or species, I should say. I guess next time we will try to look at some of the actual kingdoms and some of the names and stuff that are actually on the map itself. Starting to lose my voice anyway, so it's probably a good time to stop. Yeah, so I think that is a good place to stop for today. If anybody has any questions and wants to chat in the chat, they should do so. There's no reason not to. Yeah, I think that'll be it for today. And I'll try to, before next time, I'll try to straighten up these notes a bit more and make it a little more Gazetteer-like. And next time we'll move forward with actual, you know, descriptions of various places and things of that nature. Thanks anybody for watching, and until next time, good luck in your games.